Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, in England, and good morning in parts of the world like the far reaches of New Zealand. And good midnight to Paul House, who is with us again from Perth, Australia. Thank you so much for winning the prize for the person who has come the greatest time distance to be available with us. So I want to welcome all of our panelists who are appearing on the screen, just as I did, with just a little bit of technical difficulty, because we want to talk about whatever technical difficulties you may be having with the Crime Harm Index. We had lots of great questions from the last webinar that we didn't get to answer, and we're going to start with some of those. But I'm telling you right now that we're inviting everybody who's participating in this webinar to file under the Q&A section a question that you may have. And if you just want to start by saying raise hand that you'd like to ask the question you're writing down, we will ask you to turn your screen on and speak to everybody and tell us what your question is. So what I'm going to do is start out with some questions that we had not only at the last webinar, but people have sent to us since then, starting with this question that Lou Bland, who is our Chief Administrator, is going to read to us. So Lou, please take it away.
Lovely, thanks Larry. So the first question is from an anonymous submitter. They're asking, would it be possible to create a harm index for police incidences as opposed to crime? They've given examples of antisocial behaviour, missing persons and road traffic collisions.
Right. Well, I'm going to answer that by talking about some of the master's theses at Cambridge that have done exactly what that question is asking about. The first person to do it was Chief Superintendent Dave Laws of the City of London Police, where there have been, sadly, many fatalities from traffic accidents involving lorries and other traffic congestion in the city. And he developed a traffic injury harm index that was more responsive to the actual physical damage done to human beings than it was to the sentencing guidelines, which aren't very specific with respect to how much harm somebody suffers if they're knocked off their bicycle. And the question of criminal liability there, I think we think is less important than the amount of physical injury, the life-threatening or life-altering kinds of damage. So I think it was very useful for him to develop it for that specific purpose. And we wouldn't say that that should be included in the Crime Harm Index. It's the idea of using the Crime Harm Index as a metaphor, as a model for focusing on any particular kind of policing. Another good example is Kent McFadzean's development of the Fraud Harm Index, which is part of his work also with the City of London Police. And not to be focused just on the city, Ralph Jackman with Norfolk Police developed a sex offenders harm index to be used specifically for managing people who are on the registry of sex offenders. Ryan Doyle was using harm index in various ways with the missing persons report that has just been published, an analysis of 92,000 missing persons cases from Devon and Cornwall over 11 years. So what I'd encourage anybody who's working in a particularly complex area to do is to think, well, is the off-the-shelf principle of a sentencing or sentencing guideline-based index what we need for this particular problem? And if the answer is no, develop something that's more appropriate. The main point is to get away from counting all crimes as if they are created equal. And I don't think anybody here would argue that they are. But I would argue that Lou should ask us another question from the last webinar, because we're going to try to keep these answers short. Lou, take it away.
So the second question is from Stephen Russell, and he's asking, is there a manual or a method document to allow forces to apply this to their data?
Okay, Matt Bland is going to take that one, since he's teaching a lot of our students how to do that. Matt?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so there's two key things I think you can use. One is the technical side, which is the spreadsheet, which we keep on the Cambridge Centre for Evidence-Based Policing website. You can download that. No, you don't need to put passwords in or anything like that. It's free downloadable on an XLS format, and that's got lookup codes for Home Office counting codes if you're working on it in the UK. And then there are a number of goes at trying to translate that into different IT system configurations. The other document is the original Sherman, Nehru and Nehru guidance on what the Cambridge Crime Harm Index is all about. And I'd recommend using that in tandem with the spreadsheet to help you interpret it as you go along.
Okay, and Suzanne Kanabi-Nicole, our communications director, just put the link to the UK sentencing guidelines. May-Britt Ronaldo has a different answer to that on what's being done to help implement this in Sweden. May-Britt, you want to tell us about that? With your camera on?
Yeah, my camera is on. Yeah, what we will do is that we will implement the Swedish Crime Harm Index into the existing IT tools for police officers. And additionally to that, it will be a handbook written. So it will be easy for police officers on the beat to use the Crime Harm Index. And as it's now is developed only for the police to begin with, hopefully it will be something that all the authorities that work with crime will adapt in time, but we start with the police.
That's great, May-Britt. And now Lou has a question from an important player on the team at Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Service. And Robin Laird's question, Lou, would you tell us what he is asking us about? And we'll see if we can get Peter Nehru to answer that.
Yeah, sure. So Robin is asking, how does the Crime Harm Index work for example, a simple theft with a very vulnerable and frightened victim compared to a theft from somebody who doesn't care about being a victim? So how does it take into account victim impact?
Peter?
The short answer is it doesn't, because it's not designed to do that. The Crime Harm Index is designed to look at all crime that is recorded and available to the police from that direction. In order to do the kind of assessment that Robin's talking about, and I can see he's on the call, you've got to do a very different thing. You've got to speak to individual witnesses and have a checklist of factors that might, and indeed you can weight those in terms of the scale of the trauma and the damage, and you can look at the cost of crime. And there are a variety of different techniques that have been developed to do that. But that's a different animal. That's not what we're trying to do with the Crime Harm Index. What we're trying to do there is to take all types of a certain crime and weight them against all other types of different crimes. And that means looking at a point that relates to each crime. Now, quite a lot of the crimes in the Home Office system break down into quite fine categories, so you can differentiate, and you could, and we have done in a number of cases, actually use some of the aggravating boxes. There's usually a 9-box system on a UK sentencing guideline, and you could move up and down those if you wanted to reflect standard crime, a more aggravated crime, and then the more serious end of that particular crime. And that's perfectly possible to do, but it would not be possible to break it down within the scope of this scheme for individual victims. You need a different tool to do that.
And there's a broader perspective on the same issue, which is essentially about the purpose of this tool, which is not necessarily to provide the right point estimate for each offense, but it's about creating an average level of harm that is indeed what the Sentencing Guidelines Council tries to take into account, minus well-defined aggravating and mitigating circumstances. So if we think of an average as consisting of something that involves a full distribution of experiences, from having your foot in a frozen pond of water, your left foot, and then your right foot is in a bucket of boiling water, then on average you're comfortable, as the old joke goes. It's not so funny, especially to imagine the pain that person would be in. And certainly the extremes of things that look like minor offenses for vulnerable people who don't have much resources, are very painful indeed. But there's a larger point here about the perfect being the enemy of the good. And I'd just like to briefly mention what the FBI tried to do about this particular problem of breaking up these offense categories into very important differences. For example, an aggravated assault in the United States, I've seen one coded as somebody throwing a balled up piece of paper at somebody in close quarters. It also includes shooting a gun at somebody and the bullet hits them, and they may come very close to death. So if you have a category that broad, it cries out for refinement. And the FBI heard that in the 1970s. And by the 1980s, they were rolling with a program called NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And some states are participating in NIBRS, others aren't. Some departments are participating in NIBRS, others aren't. The basic reaction after 3 decades has been this is too complicated, and we don't see what the point of it is if we're not going to be allocating resources or using other decision making that is supported by these kinds of fine gradations. I don't think that we need much more precision to understand whether the country is getting more dangerous or safe, or whether the Northwest Basic Command Unit of the Met is more dangerous this year than the Southeast is. The refinements probably wouldn't make much difference at that level. Where they can make a difference is in rank ordering victims who are at different levels of risk, of harm, of high harm. And that's one of the fundamentals that we teach in our courses. So that it is very important to understand these issues. And at some point, I think it's even more important to get to the refinements of how much harm, just like an auto accident, how much harm happens from a GBH. A grievous bodily harm in England and Wales can differ, again, quite enormously in exactly how much harm is caused. But I don't think we can do it all, or another adage might be, you've got to walk before you can run. And I think the place we've got to walk here, and why it's so important everybody on this webinar can bring this message back, is that we've got to stop counting crimes as if they're created equal. And the first step is to put much more emphasis on a very simple, some would say simplistic, but still better than all crimes created equal system. And that's our defense of arguing that police forces should adopt it. And as we'll hear increasingly today, some of them are adopting. You want to pick up on anything on that, Peter, before we go to the next question?
No, that's fine, Larry. I think that's answered that one.
Okay, so Lou, we have another question from the last seminar, and then we will go to Rhiannon's question from this seminar. But give us the one from the last seminar first.
That is actually Rhiannon's question. So I'll go on to that. So this is from Rhiannon from University of Sheffield, who wonderfully was able to be with us last time, is with us today as well. So she's asking, how do you suggest she approaches offences that don't appear in the guidelines? And also, how do you weigh attempted offences?
Right. Well, Matt and May Britt, I think, can give some good answers to that. Matt, you want to start us off on the English perspective on attempted versus completed? What's the underlying logic here?
So it's back to perfect being the enemy of the good, really. Not every offence in the Home Office classifications has an obvious minimum sentencing guideline. Most of them do, but there are obscure ones that don't. And Eleanor, like me, will have severe headaches at times when we try to go and find something, and you have to dig around for quite a long time to do it. Sometimes it can be a case of finding the best nearest match of an offence. We then put that through a controlled process. So we have a panel which we will submit proposals to, who will agree something, and then we will update the final spreadsheet so it's embedded in the downloadable version of the harm index. On attempted offences, they do appear in the Home Office classifications, and they do have sentencing guidelines. Invariably, they are weighted the same as the actual offence. So if you search for the word attempted on the spreadsheet, you'll find that there are instances in there of attempted offences but an attempt kidnap is weighted the same as a kidnap, for example.
Right. Actually, Paul House wants to add to that. Paul, go ahead.
Just to say that here in WA, our Sentencing Act actually allows a provision for attempted offences whereby the maximum sentence is cut in half. So when applying values to a crime harm index, what I did here is just took the crime harm index value for the actual sentence, or the median sentence that I calculated, and then divided that by 2 for an attempted offence.
And that's how the offense was reported, as an attempted offense. It was convicted as an attempted offense, and therefore you use the reduced sentencing practice.
That's right.
Right. Okay. Well, that's really interesting, especially in light of what I think may bother a lot more people when we start rank ordering offenders based on the charges that have been filed against them, without requiring that there be convictions, or rank ordering victims with the reported offenses against them without requiring that somebody was even arrested for that offense. We're now looking at considering crime in a different context than the courtroom, and a different context from I think, a legal framework for estimating harm, as distinct from what underlies this whole approach, and that is social science. That is, crime statistics are an exercise in measurement. Measurement is an attempt to take an underlying phenomenon and characterize it in readily objective terms that everybody can see. The easiest way to do that is with a number. So if we start with most police reported crimes, that is, crimes reported to the police, not getting solved at all, we'd either have to throw them all out, as Brazil does, which when I went there 15 years ago, they said they only count as a murder an offense for which there was a conviction. Well, that's surely a good way to keep your homicide rate down, to look good in UN statistics comparing across countries. But then this is not really an approach that is much used across countries for precisely those reasons. Our basic hope is that it can be used within countries, but in places like the US, it may well be that it's only good to be used within states, or possibly even within counties or within cities, because practices of counting, differences in reporting can vary so much. So again, we don't necessarily want to have a tool that is limited by each local jurisdiction. I think what we're really talking about here is a conceptual approach that can be refined anywhere for any particular purpose. And so we're encouraging you to think not like lawyers, but like social scientists who are trying to estimate in the eyes of the public, the sustainability and legitimacy of the police, depending on public trust and confidence. What is it that we are trying to accomplish that is reflected in what the judges have decided is the relative severity of punishment that's appropriate, again, with a view to the public and their eyes on public opinion polls as they try to judge that in a very systematic way, as opposed to, shall we say, 5 people in an ops room sitting around and deciding a set of priorities based on their own personal perspectives, which is a far cry from having a bunch of numbers from an imperfect yet systematic in its imperfections, the systematic approach of a crime harm index. And I think it's time for Peter to clarify what I've just said.
Well, I was going to pick up the point about the comparisons across countries. I know we've got a couple of other questions that touch on various aspects of this, but there's been a sort of assumption about harm indices and comparators between different countries, that when you applied a technique like this to a range of different countries, you'd end up with widely different scores. And our experience thus far is that that isn't the case. There is actually quite a considerable amount of consistency across countries. Although rather ironically, you mentioned the United States of America, it turned out that there was more difference between 2 states in the US than there was between half a dozen countries that we compared when we'd constructed the indices. So there is something slightly odd going on in the United States, but I expect Rene could comment on that one. But there was a very considerable consistency, even across jurisdictions that were not, as it were, the Anglo-Saxon common law jurisdiction. So it's a slightly more consistent. And of course, the more that we do this, the more that we replicate it, and the more that we can look at comparisons across similar ranges of offences, the more that we'll be able to test that particular theory.
Okay, well, Renee, maybe we should get you to comment from a US perspective, and Natalie from a Canadian perspective, on how far you think you ought to go beyond one jurisdiction in terms of, things like allocating state money for dealing with violent crime the way it's been allocated in England and Wales in the past several years. How shall we say, useful and reliable is one of the US sentencing approaches to crime harm index? Or do you think it really does depend on having the kind of sentencing guidelines that England and Wales can offer?
Actually, I sent Peter a message because I'm like, what 2 states? But I could see, I mean, even not even knowing the 2 states, I could see how there would be big differences between states. I did my work in California, but I know, like right now, a perfect example is possession of marijuana has been legalized in many states, and has been a misdemeanor even before it was legalized in California for a long time, where it was still a felony in other states. So you had this huge disparity of how much time people were serving in jails for the same crime in different states across the country. So when I think about like how to make that more even, and then how to allocate like resource dollars, I think there is something to be said to figure out like how to make it more even across the country. Because yeah, if you think about, especially where our state lines cross, that if you're, 10 miles within some state line, you could be convicted in one state, 5 more years, versus if you were 10 miles to the south, you would have, the amount of time you spent in jail would be 10 years left, or 10 years in prison. So I think the United States right now we're so varied across our states that we would need an individual crime harm index across each state, and then maybe averaging all 50 to somehow come up with like one sentencing structure to use, maybe.
Well, there's where I think we go beyond the purpose of a crime harm index. We're not here to be all things to all people. And I'm very happy to have a police force use whatever index it chooses to try to run the police force in a much more rational way. Doesn't matter what the police force next door is doing. We leave it at that. There is a picture of a family in England that has a property in which their garden is in one COVID tier, with different rules and restraints on the occupants of the property in that area, and their house is in a different tier. And so I guess as long as they don't go out into their garden, they'll stay under one set of rules. But somewhere these boundaries get us in trouble. Natalie comes from Canada, where it's well known that the state or province of Quebec has far higher crime severity scores than the other provinces, or at least they used to. And so I wonder whether if there is any national money being doled out, there's any issue about whether that's actually reflecting difference in harm or difference in reporting, and whether Canada can get on just as well by having Ontario use the crime severity scores and not pay any attention to what's going on in Alberta or out in Vancouver. So Natalie, what do you think about this from a Canadian perspective?
Well, from a Canadian perspective, I know that Quebec is still up there, but there's other cities that are certainly emerging, like Edmonton and Winnipeg out west, as scoring very high in crime severity. I think that we're lucky. We do have the Criminal Code of Canada and the Canadian Crime Severity Index that's built on that, which makes it great for a uniform application no matter what province that you're living in. I think that there is some we're kind of in infancy in terms of Canada in operationalizing the crime severity index in policing. I'm hoping that we're able to adopt it and apply it in policing within Ontario fairly shortly, as being one of the bigger provinces. I think that in terms of the crime harm index, obviously my specialty is looking at victim and offender relationships, so offending as well as victimization. I think in terms of what we do need to share and what there needs to be more of, and I know that in the States they do run into some issues with sharing police data. I think that if you're having crimes that are occurring, again, province to province, but even if you look locally within the provinces, if you have crimes occurring, say, within my jurisdiction by certain types of criminals or people being victimized, we're so close together that the borders are really borderless. You can have offenders that are committing crimes within my jurisdiction and 2 neighboring jurisdictions. However, we're not sharing the data appropriately to really look at what that looks like, what the picture really looks like on a local level. So I would say if we're talking about the crime severity index on a local level, definitely sharing police data would be a good plan to give us a more holistic picture on what we should do with that information.
Great, thanks, Natalie. Now, May Britt has something I think you could say about a different issue, which is not across jurisdictions at the same point in time, but actually there's a bit of this argument going on in Sweden right now about whether crime has actually gotten a lot more harmful in Sweden, according to a harm index, because it is more harmful, or because there's been changes in the way that there might be reporting or even classification of these offenses. And in a minute, I'm going to ask Lou to bring in the question we had from the University of Montreal, which is on a related issue. But May Britt, tell us what you know about this debate and whether you think the Swedish Crime Harm Index, even in version 3 that you're about to roll out, would be reliable, say, for the last 20 years, or would you want to be as qualified as I think we have to be about England and Wales because they changed the counting rules so much over that time period?
Well, what have happened last year is that there has been a change in the approach from the politicians and also the public about the sentences that are supposed to be given. And we have now a big debate within both groups that we would like to increase the penalties, particularly prison time. And of course, that would change the Swedish Crime Harm Index, particularly the third one that we are now developing, that will be based on the sentences from last year. So what we talk about is to have a kind of repeating update, like each second or each third year, to be sure about that we cover the progress within the country, because that is interesting to see. And even though that it might be seriously more violent or more higher sentences, it will be harder to compare, but we still can see the differences from year to year. And we can also explain it when we do the analysis of the final result.
Sure.
Because we can tell 2020 was this and 2023 we had this kind of penal code and sentencing style.
So what you can do statistically is to go back even 10 years and use the current sentencing framework to see whether the change in harm is going to disappear if you hold constant the sentencing values from either 2020 or 2010, whatever they might be. And in fact, you can compute both lines. And if you hold constant the measurement, then the lines might stay flat. They might go up. They might even go down. And that brings us to Lou. I'm going to ask you to read our question from Juliet Jarvis at the University of Montreal.
Sure. So Juliet's asking us, how do we suggest taking into account changes that can affect reporting, for example, sexual assaults?
Right. So here's a good example, because in the Swedish case, May Britt is saying, let's increase the penalty for rape, say, make it twice as big, 10 years to 20 years, just as a hypothetical. And so that's a clear legal change that can be tracked and looked at statistically. I think what Juliet is asking us about at University of Montreal is a different issue, which is that if citizen behavior changes, if people become more willing to report a crime given the occurrence of a crime, or if police behavior changes insofar as it's more encouraging and they train investigators to be more welcoming or empathetic to people who are reporting rapes, that's harder to measure systematically, and that it is the kind of thing that Eleanor Nehru has pointed out, as we mentioned in last week's webinar, about changes in the Home Office counting rules, which caused a big disruption in the trend line of crime harm index as of 2008. And then after 2013 or so, a real huge increase in the amount of high harm sexual offenses that were reported, but which were historic. So I think we have this challenge of trying to say this tool is better for some purposes than others. And to the extent that long-term measurement of whether societies are getting more safe or less safe, which is a terribly important political question, it actually doesn't help much in terms of actually targeting and attacking crime. And if we want to prevent crime, we might want to try to duck these questions and to start looking at differences across victims, across offenders, across places, across neighborhoods in the most recent year. And so you're not worried about the trends over time, or even, in fact, whether systematically one part of Montreal is measuring differently from another part of Montreal. And we know that in big cities that can often be the case. But again, if we just stick to our own local patch and try to control for these factors of reporting, we might be well off. So Renee, in Sacramento, when you were looking at the hotspots, do you think the crimes were being reported differently by either the public or the police in different sectors or different patrol beats in Sacramento? Or were you pretty confident there was a kind of one culture of whatever counting rules or reporting rules they were using, they were pretty constant across the Sacramento police force in a city of what, 750,000?
Actually, well, it was a little smaller than that. I think we're still holding around a little over 500,000, right around there. But we do have, because it's the capital, our during the day it goes up to 1 million. But no, I would not say across the city that reporting is the same, because you have a variety of different reasons why people choose to report or not report, either because a certain type of crime isn't that big of a deal to them, so they don't report because maybe they have insurance, or they don't want to wait around for somebody to come take their report or what have you, or in some cases, depending on who the offender is, if it's a close family member, they might not want to get that person into trouble, so they don't report, versus other areas of the city where they're more likely to report. So yeah, when it comes to that, I think the culture within neighborhoods, like your own culture that you were raised in, as far as protecting family members and or what you've been taught and how to use police as a resource, I think those are all influences on how reporting occurs.
Now, this gets us to the question of whether there's any alternatives to the reports created by police when people talk to them. And without resolving this issue, I just want to put another fact on the table, because I only recently discovered it when I had to lecture at the National Police Academy in Bangladesh. And because West Bengal is culturally part of Bengal as an area that got divided in 1947, it was very interesting to them what has developed in West Bengal, which is actually a part of India, not Bangladesh. And it's about sexual harassment, which in South Asia is called eve teasing, but it can be actually quite serious sexual assaults of women walking down the streets who get grabbed by men, and they go to police stations to report it, and the police won't write it down for lots of cultural reasons. But what happened was that a women's group got together and created an online reporting system for the locations and times of these sexual harassment incidents. And now they've got a hotspot map for sexual harassment that's online. And if you're going to walk down the street in this town, which is the second largest city in West Bengal, right after Calcutta, you can at least know where the most sexual harassment reports have been recorded by the victims. And so the idea of having victim reported constancy or variability in this equation really adds to the larger view here, which is what this is all about, is trying to predict and prevent harm. And variations in how much harm there is can take specific forms of harm, which get in the way of having a kind of bottom line for crime, which is what I like to say is one better argument for it. But I think that argument may be limited to places like Britain, where there's an enormous amount of pressure, not to mention punishment associated with compliance with strict crime reporting rules, which has only become more true in the past decade, I think, than ever before. But at this point, I think we should go to another question. Lou, how about question number 11?
So this one is from an attendee from last time, Clifford. So he's asking, is spiking someone with drugs classed as administering poison? If so, why does this score higher than using a noxious substance to cause harm and intimidate? Is administering poison in this respect a potential harm, while using a noxious substance will be definitive harm? These have crime harm index scores of 3285 and 2190 respectively.
Now, Eleanor Nehru has probably encountered and grappled with more crime categories and tried to appreciate their logic than anybody else on our team. Eleanor, do you want to comment on that one in the context of there being 15,000 some offense types, and we've only got 750 of them with clear guidelines and classifications? But is there a good general answer to those kinds of specifics as a problem, considering they're both kind of attempted murders? And you want to turn on your mic?
Yep.
Thanks.
So actually, when I went back and looked at this, the scores weren't correct. They weren't using the same logic, because they both said with endangering life. So I've actually gone and changed them, and we'll have a new version with them scoring the same of 3,285 points in the end.
Good. Thank you, Clifford. You've improved our crime harm index tools available to the English and Welsh police working with them. Thank you.
Yeah, basically because they're both saying endangering life, they should have both been scored as attempted murder. And for one, I'd used an aggravated version of GBH with intent, and the other one I hadn't. So I went back and looked, double checked, and I think it makes more sense for them to both be the consistent higher score. It is tricky with these offences because there's so many different things where it says noxious substance, administering poison, and it's not always clear exactly how they should score when they're being sentenced. There's no sentencing guidelines, so then I have to use sort of proxy offences. So yeah, there was just a little mistake here out of the 700 offences that we did score.
Great. Well, constant tracking is a way to lead to constant or continuous quality improvement. So thanks again, Clifford. Thank you, Eleanor, for your very open-minded approach to dealing with this. Peter, your comment.
Yeah, the example that was given is just a perfect illustration of the rather overwhelming need for England and Wales to reform the Offences Against the Person Act, which is the most gloriously out-of-date piece of Victorian legislation, full of words that we don't use these days, and drafted in a way that does reflect its 1860s origins, and I suspect also the kind of the language almost implies that the poisoner is going to be a woman. It is that kind of old-fashioned legislation, and it's. I'm sorry, but it reads like the product of a Victorian crime magazine, and the Law Commission has been trying to reform that legislation for over 20 years. It is overtime to get that sorted out, because when the other aspects of it were sorted out in the up-to-date modern sexual offences legislation, the process became much clearer, and the concepts were applied consistently across the different parts of the legislation. And that is a bigger piece. When you start doing what we've been doing with the crime harm stuff, you start picking up some very significant problems with some of the existing criminal justice legislation. And as Ellen has pointed out, we do our best to try and make it consistent across the piece and to be as transparent in the way that we do it, so you can see our workings, which is, I think, the critical thing.
Absolutely. Well, Lou, you want to continue this line with question 12 from the last webinar?
Yeah, so this one is asking, very simply, is the crime harm index for offenders over 18 or 21 years of age?
I'm going to ask May-Britt to comment on this because I think it's been a key issue in the development in Sweden, and Eleanor as well, from the larger conceptual standpoint of whether we're measuring things that happen to victims or things that offenders do. But May-Britt, why don't you tell us how this affects the change in Sweden?
Yeah, the second version of the Swedish Crime Harm Index was based on 18 years, but as we know that there is mitigations due to the fact that they are very young, we decided to do the third version of the Swedish Crime Harm Index from age of 21, because as you said earlier, we do not look at a specific case, we look at the average of the harm on it places or persons or whatever it is that we try to calculate. So everyone about 21 that will get a sentence, we calculate on the crime codes, because we use crime codes instead of the description of the crime. And it will level on all ages from 15, that is the age of that you can be punished for a criminal act in Sweden, until the very day that before you're passing away. It will be the same.
And to remind everybody that in Sweden, as in Western Australia, the value for the crime harm index is comprised of the average sentence within a population. And when you include juveniles in that average sentence, you take into account the lower sentences usually given to juveniles. So by raising the threshold to 21, so it's just adults, it raises the average penalty of actually imposed sentences. And in fact, Paul, I think you had to deal with that as well in the Western Australia Crime Harm Index. Do you have a comment on the role of minor versus major age groups in terms of weighting the severity of each crime type? And you need to turn on your mic, Paul. Thanks.
Something that we've looked at specifically, but what we do know is that a large proportion of offences in WA here are conducted by juveniles. So it's very likely that our scores are affected by those people. We are not in a position to revisit the calculations and take out the juveniles just yet. The crime index, I think, needs to be adopted a bit more holistically before we tweak it again.
Right. And I would say that it really doesn't matter in the short run as long as it's used consistently. But when people start getting into value or moral arguments about whether that's enough punishment for a certain offense, and I think that that can happen, that one way to deal with it is to take out the juvenile penalty, to say that, well, this really is a serious crime that for a grown-up gets treated quite severely in this country. Eleanor, what about the way in which the crime severity scores with the Office of National Statistics have been dealing with age compared to the way the Cambridge Crime Harm Index deals with the age of the offender or age of the victim even? And how do we compare in terms of being age blind or indeed age biased, perhaps, if we take the Office of National Statistics approach as it exists and may actually soon change?
So I know for some crimes, such as sexual crimes, the Office for National Statistics separates them by age. We do similar. So you have, for sexual offences, you have a sort of under 13, under 16, and an adult version, which I think is certainly justifiable. I don't think they look at it by the age of the offender. And neither do we, because basically we want to be able to compare the harm of the crime categories rather than the harm committed by that specific offender.
Okay, that's great. Lou, why don't you give us question 13 about hotspots and harm spots, and I'm going to ask Renee to comment on that as well as Paul. And then we'll go on to Matt on detections and with question 14. But question 13, Lou, take it away.
Yeah, sure. So this is from Dr. Lawrence, who was with us last time. So she is asking, the information about the crime hotspots versus harm spots is really interesting. Would this technique also help identify which kinds of offences are dispersed and which are not following active policing?
Right. So I think we could ask Renee to talk about that. You have some data that would actually answer that question, Renee. And if you can turn on your mic, you'll tell us. Thanks.
Yeah. So, because we did this in Sacramento, looking at our hotspots and then changing it into a crime harm index and looking at the harm spots. And what we really showed, and I did this after the fact. So just to be clear, it wasn't that I did harm spots and then hot spots. It was harm spots translated into, or hotspots translated into harm spots. So in my areas that we were looking at, it was only 2 distinct parts of Sacramento. So it was the downtown area and then one more residential area. So in our downtown business area, when we disaggregated into the harm spots, what we saw is we didn't get that variability the way you would have seen in some other areas, because what was really driving a lot of our harm in the downtown area was your theft. So rather than these low incident, high harm, we had a lot of like low harm, but a lot of high incidents in the downtown area, because you have the, the bike theft, the shoplifting, the, your minor theft from the parks, things like that. So, but once we moved out into the residential area, that's where you started seeing a little bit more variability, because that's when you started to see the assaults come into effect, or robberies where the incidents were lower, but the amount of harm was higher. So I would say when you look at harm spots, it is going to give you a different view of your city and probably help you understand the variability of what's occurring out in your city and different neighborhoods or different communities and even different street segments when you're looking at harm versus just straight crime counts. So I'm hoping that helps answer her questions as far as like how things are dispersed.
Yeah, I think it did. And speaking of dispersing, I know that a lot of us of our participants are planning on dispersing at the end of the hour. So while I've got everybody here, I'd like to announce that as of today, at least for all of England, the apprenticeship levy will allow the police forces of England to send apprentices to the Cambridge course that will actually begin and end with a stay at Cambridge University with online face-to-face and lectures and discussions in between. All of that will be funded by the apprenticeship levy, so it won't cost the English police forces a penny to enroll analysts. And the plan right now is to enroll teams or pairs of analysts with sergeants or with inspectors to have a combination of operational leaders with analysts working side by side, so they can define a project and put it together with the analysts providing the information and the leadership understanding what the information means and how to use it. So we're very excited that we can offer this apprenticeship in collaboration with the Opportunities Partnership Group, which has been offering a variety of apprenticeships for some time. We expect to launch our first one in February, and the speed with which we can offer this course to analysts and middle-level police leaders around England will depend on our ability to recruit the kind of people, some of whom may be watching this webinar, to help us out with the tutorials, the kind we've done with almost 200 people in our online courses that are fee paid by police agencies from all over the world, including Britain. But for those in England, this will be effectively a free course because the levy cost has already been deducted from the payroll of those forces. So watch our website for that kind of information. And just remember that in the course like that, you'll learn to understand how an experiment like the one that Paul House worked on in Western Australia might have been chosen based on crime hotspots of crime counts, but actually turned out to have huge effects on crime harm. Paul, I may not have the story right, but can you say that we were able to demonstrate that at least at the kinds of hotspots, the 15 hotspots that were chosen for rotating, having a patrol or not, were certainly amenable to even small amounts of patrol making a big difference. And maybe you should just briefly summarize again how we could respond to that question with your example from Western Australia.
That's right, Larry. Yes, so we saw a approximately 62% reduction in crime harm, I think it was. It was quite a large reduction in crime harm at those hotspots that were patrolled. The spots were chosen based on their crime count, not on their crime harm. But I was about to say that Renee must have been to that same location because my story reflects hers exactly. Low harm, high volume in the town centre where the hotspots were patrolled, and in the residential areas, the higher harm, those areas weren't patrolled. But yeah, it was those low harm, high volume offences that drove down the harm score by such a large percentage. It was quite interesting to see.
That's really good. And I'm wondering if we can go to question 25, please, Lou, and get Natalie to give us her thoughts about whether you can change the index around or mix and match it for different purposes, which I think she's done more creatively than most people we know. So give us the question that we had from Ruth in the last webinar, please, Lou.
Lovely, thanks. So what the question was is, can the crime harm index be altered in any way for when dealing with law enforcement oversight, so professional standards type situations, when the investigations involve members of law enforcement?
Great. Okay, Natalie, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a tough question. There's a couple questions about the question and the fact that it doesn't exactly say which particular component. So I'm going to make some assumptions about that. And as well, when examining and analyzing offenses under police, there's Police Services Acts, there's the criminal code. Police obviously are subject to a lot of different types of legislation and rules. So it is a very interesting question. I have never personally applied the crime harm index that way, and neither has my police service. But again, it's a great question. So in looking at here, it talks about when analyzing officer offenses, but I would say that you could also look at officer victim harm as well, because it's just like in the public, there's victimization and offending as well. The same is true within police departments in terms of officers, as we know here locally, across North America and globally, there are certain situations where officers are subject of serious scrutiny because of offending. So yes, I think that it could be altered. I have altered certain components and adapted the Canadian Crime Severity Index to look at very specific areas within offending and victimization. So I think it is has the ability to withstand creativity and innovation and in altering it and applying it in different ways. Could you apply it to this type of work within law enforcement? That's a very, very big question. I know locally, if I'm looking at a Canadian circumstance or within my own jurisdiction, I don't think we have enough offending to apply it to look for patterns. But maybe if you applied it over 10 years worth of data that you would have accumulated, I don't know what your systems and processes are or what country this question is originating from, but certainly you would have to have a systematic approach to collecting the data on officers as victims and in offenders in order to pull something from it. Is it impossible? No, I don't think it is. And you may or may not have that in place already. It would be interesting to see, if you were to apply it this way, what the patterns would be in terms of offending, and maybe it would be something in looking at harm, because then you would be able to tell internally where you would have to invest your resources, maybe into police officer training, development, coaching, mentoring, performance assessments, maybe promotional criteria. So yes, I think that it could be adaptable in looking at where the harm is happening in terms of being caused and being suffered in the police landscape. But again, I think that, and help us allocate our resources and decision-making appropriately. But I think the big question is, do you have a system and a process in place that captures that data? Here, my experience is that we do not have something capturing that over the last 10 years for you to get a very clear picture and able to paint something for you to target or examine or analyze in order to prevent harm. So I think that's my answer.
Well, I'm going to ask a question of Polly, who had a Q posted in the Q&A. Whether she would like to ask it, but before she's thinking about that, I did want to add to Natalie's answer that from a U.S. perspective, I would draw people's attention to the pattern of repeated and accelerating totals of harm associated with a small number of outliers. We've discussed them in the context of rogue cops in the Cambridge Journal of Evidence-Based Policing, or even rogue police agencies, and the New Yorker's profile of the Vallejo, California Police Department, published recently, contains a number of repeat cases involving the same officers, as in Derek Chauvin with the George Floyd death in Minneapolis, having had 17 or 18 prior complaints. It's an interesting question of whether, if you were to apply a criminal code perspective to those priors as an investigative issue, which is what we do generally with crime harm index, whether you could in fact have a more objective way for identifying officers who might have an accelerating trajectory in terms of the kind of harm it is being alleged that they are committing illegally, or at least in violation of department rules. And we had another question coming into this webinar about the extent to which police regulators could use this, possibly the Independent Office of Police Complaints in the UK, or even HMIC might want to take that on board. But Holly, would you like to be the one person who actually reads their question on the screen, just like on BBC, or would you rather have Peter, who I think answered the question and then it disappeared, tell us what the question was and what the answer was? Holly, just put a hand up if Lou can spot you anywhere, if you'd like to speak, and if not, we'll just ask Peter to take it. Lou, is Holly interested in becoming famous to a group of 55 people?
Oh, she is saying okay, yes.
Great, okay, Holly, nice to meet you. Let's have your camera on.
I'm going to make sure you can come on camera. So I think that'll just take a few seconds for that to come through.
There, and you just turn your camera and your mic on, Polly, and I think we'll be able to see you as you ask the question. We can hear you if you hit your microphone off mute.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah. You want to put on your camera too?
feeling a bit shy right now.
Okay, we'll just listen real carefully. So go ahead.
Fantastic. So my question was very much around how the crime harm index reflects the changes in crimes that have come forward during the pandemic, and particularly with regards to cases around domestic abuse, where the risk of harm has increased, and how that might be applied not just to the existing crime harm index, but to global policing and other forms of indexes that are being applied.
Well, one of our members of this panel is a member of the Scientific Advisory Group to Government for Emergencies, or SAGE. I won't tell you who that is, but I'll ask Peter Neyroud to answer your question.
So this is an absolutely fascinating question. So there's several elements to it which the crime harm index provides something we haven't had up to now. So first off, there has been this year, as it should be fairly obvious, even in the immortal words of the Home Secretary, who said that shoplifting is down. Well, if you close the shops, it will be. But there have been some dramatic changes. Our colleague, Professor Manuel Eisner, has been doing a global survey in about 20 different countries, looking at the changes. It's not actually, you've talked about the kind of assumption that domestic abuse is up. It's not quite as straightforward as that. It's a somewhat more complicated picture than might seem. I mean, for obvious reasons, a lot of the street crimes of like robbery and a lot of sort of thefts in public spaces have gone down in many countries, including the UK. But they've also bounced back pretty rapidly as things have opened back up again, and Manuel's about to publish that data, so you'll be able to see that in the public domain. What has also happened is there have been a range of what I would describe as new crimes, and they're not new crimes in the sense that they were still a category, but they were new crimes in terms of the scale and shifting focus of different types of victim. Notably, there have been a really significant number of countries where in the second wave there have been quite significant and aggravated assaults on staff at hospitals and attacks on hospitals and medical facilities. And my guess is, as the vaccination process rolls out, that may occur in quite a number of countries in a pretty unpleasant way as people get desperate for the vaccine. So that's going to require. That's been one of the things that we've been concerned about on SAGE. So, but CHR is capable of being adapted to deal with that. For new offences, we can simply use the same mechanism that we use now. We take the standard final penalty at the bottom end of the process, the starting point, and we apply it. So we can look at whether there's been a significant additional harm as a result of breaches or restrictions, and we can compare different jurisdictions to some extent on that as well. I mean, over 1 million tickets issued in Paris alone, and considerably less than that in the whole of the UK, suggests a very different perception of the approach to enforcement. On domestic abuse, we've got a very well constructed set of, as Matt has replied, we've got a very well constructed set of guidance in the CHI on the starting points for those, and including we've just adjusted that for the one for coercive control after we realised that it wasn't reflecting the seriousness that Parliament had put in place, even though the sentencing guidelines were still trying to catch up. So it's there, and we can use CHR to pattern these things.
Thank you, Peter. Lou, I'm going to ask you to skip to the last question, number 44. And in light of the fact that it's 5:15, Zoom is going to make us all turn into a pumpkin, I'm going to ask Matt to try to tackle this first, but I'm going to ask for a number of views because I think the question really goes to the heart of what CHI is all about. So go ahead, Lou, give us the question and we'll start off with Matt.
Yeah, sure. So this is saying, is there an argument to consider murder outside of the crime harm index due to the skew that can be caused by one murder in a low crime area?
Matt?
Well, that's a hospital pass for the last question. So from a moral, ethical point of view, no, I think it should be a key part of any measurement of crime. But there is subtlety into how you handle it with any analytical framework. So it will skew it. It's certainly not the only crime type that will skew an analysis, and the extent of that skew will depend on how many cases you're looking at, what time frame, these sort of details that you need to work in. And there is nothing wrong with excluding outliers from, say, a strategic analysis where you want to profile resources, where you should put resources in the long term. It's quite a sensible approach to think about removing outliers from that. That might not just be limited to murder. That might go further than that. But I don't think in the grand scheme of things you can exclude it 100%. I think it's an observable harm in the spirit of the framework, in the spirit of the sentencing guidelines. It has a minimum sentence of that size for a reason, and you should respect that. But no, absolutely no reason why you shouldn't remove it as an outlier.
Okay, so Paul House worked on this experiment in which there were several thousand hotspot days. If on one of the control days a murder had occurred, it would have greatly inflated the effect of the patrol, because the murder didn't happen on a patrolling day. It happened on a day when there wasn't patrol. Paul, if there had been that kind of situation, what would you have done with the murder, just for the sake of getting a fair estimate of what's the effect of patrol on hotspots? And let me just preface my remarks by saying that I think we need to be aware that there are a variety of ways to handle this. So there's no one right answer necessarily, but what would you have done, Paul? And then I'm going to ask Peter what he thought was appropriate to do with the Turning Point experiment in Birmingham before we wrap this up. So, Paul, what do you think?
We would have removed it as an outlier, purely because it would have skewed the results so greatly that they would have impacted on the final analysis. But the reason why we would remove it is, if we were to then ask officers, okay, let's designate this control spot as a hotspot because of that, or harm spot because of that murder, they would have come back to us and said, well, no, it's a one-off. It's something that doesn't usually happen there. And we have used the crime harm index to guide officer decision making, not to say, okay, this is definitive, this is the only reason for it being designated as a hotspot. So we wouldn't have included it.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, Peter, when you had individual offenders, 414 in a 2-year follow-up, half of them getting prosecuted, the other half were given an opportunity for voluntary rehabilitation programs instead of being prosecuted. There were, in fact, outliers in both the experimental and the control group. So what was the decision, as you recall, with Sumit Kumar's consultation on this, about handling that issue?
So, and the straightforward thing is to be absolutely transparent. You analyze it both ways and you show your workings, and that's the critical one. But just to touch on the hotspot side of things, this is where the crime harm index overlaps with things like the signal crimes approach to neighbourhood policing, where it might be very important not to discard that single murder or that single very serious crime, and that if you're mapping community concerns across with harm, you might very well want to know that single incident. I mean, you only have to think about some of the terrible crimes like the murder of Millie Dowler to appreciate, as Martin Innes pointed out in his research on that, what an absolutely it's appalling impact, not just on the family, but also on the community that one single incident had, and how it would be very important to know that single incident, whilst there might not be other incidents around it, might have had a very significant ripple, not to say tsunami effect on the impact of in that particular community. So I think you show your workings, you might apply, lay it alongside other things, but CHI does provide you with a very good way of finding that out in amongst all of the other things going on.
Well, thank you. Eleanor News-Cat has told us that it's time to end. So I'm going to first ask everybody to thank Suzanne Kanabi-Nicole. Dr. Kanabi-Nicole is our Director of Communications, and she has been absolutely fantastic in bringing everybody together for this webinar. All of those of you who have stayed with us, We're very grateful to have you. We're grateful that Paul came all the way from Perth and that May Britt came all the way from Stockholm. And we thank Eleanor and Matthew and Lou and Renee and Peter, and thank all of you again for your interest. We will try to answer all of your questions that were posted. We didn't get to them all live, but we will be sending written answers. And if you don't get an answer to your question, keep writing. The Cambridge Center for Evidence-Based Policing is here to support anybody in the world who wants to practice evidence-based policing, and we'll do the best we can. We hope to see you in some of our courses. We also hope to see you online. Thanks again for coming, and good night, good morning, and good midday to all of you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.